They called him just the Stablehand, until he taught the boy to smile again. No one was supposed to be in the south barn that early, especially not the boy. The horses hadn't been fed, the grounds were still soaked from last night's rain, and the air hung thick with that strange stillness. Texas mornings sometimes bring, like the land was holding its breath, but the silence didn't last. It shattered with a scream so raw and desperate it could have come from a wounded animal. Then came the stomping, the thundering panic of hooves slamming against the stall gates. And over it all, a single voice cracked through the fog like a whip. "Who let him near the horse?" That voice belonged to Catherine Langston, the owner of Willow Creek Ranch. And in that moment, she wasn't the calm center of the therapeutic riding center. She was a mother on the edge of terror. The scream belonged to her son, Ben, an 8-year-old who hadn't spoken in over 2 years. No one knew exactly what had broken him. Not entirely. They only knew his father died in a car crash, and ever since, Ben had folded in on himself, living in a quiet only he could hear. Therapists had come and gone, progress measured in tiny, painful inches. And now he was inside the barn, frozen in front of Dusty, the biggest and most unpredictable horse on the property. The staff froze. No one moved. No one knew what to do. But someone did. A tall black man in a faded denim jacket stepped forward, boots muddy, cap pulled low, face unreadable. He'd only been on the ranch 3 days. Most folks didn't even know his name. "Don't," someone hissed. "You'll spook him." But he didn't listen. He walked into the barn, slow and steady, like he wasn't afraid of being trampled or screamed at. He didn't speak. He didn't reach out. He just crouched a few feet away from the boy, eyes level, hands loose by his side. And then he whistled. Soft, low, rhythmic, not a song, not a command, just a memory. Ben stopped shaking. His breath caught mid-cry. And then, impossibly, he turned his head, just slightly. His eyes met the man's. Catherine gasped. The staff looked at each other like they were watching something they didn't understand. And when Ben took one small step toward the man, toward the horse, toward the whistle, toward something that wasn't fear, the entire barn held its breath again. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment they stopped calling him just the Stablehand. If this story moves you even a little, hit the like button. And stay with us, because what happened next will remind you that healing doesn't always come from experts, but from people brave enough to sit quietly in the storm and not walk away. His name was Marcus Bell, though no one at Willow Creek Ranch had bothered to ask. To most of the staff, he was just the new guy, or the quiet one with the military stare. And he'd shown up 3 days prior with a worn duffel bag, a letter of recommendation from some shelter chaplain in Atlanta, and calloused hands that spoke louder than any resume. Catherine had hired him because they were short-staffed, and because something in his eyes looked like it had already seen more storms than Texas ever could muster. Still, that didn't stop the whispers. "You think he's all there in the head?" one wrangler murmured the day he arrived. "I heard he did tours in Iraq. Real quiet types like that. They snap." Another said, "He sleeps in the bunkhouse with the door cracked open, like he's waiting for something to come through it." And yet he showed up every morning at dawn, boots laced, sleeves rolled, no complaints, no chit-chat. He mucked stalls faster than anyone, gave the nervous horses more space than most seasoned hands, and never once raised his voice. But that moment in the barn, that single, silent connection with Ben, shifted the air around Marcus like a ripple. After the staff led the boy away, and the vet checked Dusty for any injury, Catherine found Marcus in the far paddock, scrubbing troughs like nothing had happened. She stopped several feet away, arms crossed tightly over her chest, unsure whether to thank him or fire him. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. Do what? Marcus didn't look up. Whatever that was with Ben. He paused, then straightened slowly. Sometimes you don't need to speak to be heard. Sometimes presence is louder than words. Catherine wasn't sure if that was an answer or a sermon, but it disarmed her more than she liked. He trusted you, she said after a beat. He doesn't trust anyone. Marcus nodded once, then turned back to his work. I didn't ask him to. Catherine stared at him, searching for arrogance or manipulation, but all she saw was tired steadiness, the kind born from carrying weight long after everyone else let go. Look, she said finally, I don't know who you are, and frankly I don't care what's in that past of yours. But if you hurt my son, if you get one thing wrong, you're gone. Do you understand me? Marcus wiped his hands on his jeans and met her eyes. Yes, ma'am, loud and clear. She wanted to feel satisfied, even triumphant, but as she turned and walked away, something gnawed at her, that same strange calm that had come over the barn earlier, as if the boy had recognized something in the stranger that even she, his mother, had forgotten how to give. That night, Catherine lay awake longer than usual, listening to the distant sounds of crickets and wind pushing through the trees. In her mind, she kept seeing her son, his wide, startled eyes, the way his trembling stopped when Marcus whistled. No therapist had managed that, no counselor, not even her, and that realization sat heavy on her chest like a question she didn't want to ask out loud. Had she been trying too hard to fix her son, instead of simply staying with him? The next morning, the ranch stirred to life under a pale blue sky brushed with the first threads of sunlight. Horses stomped softly in their stalls. Dew clung to the wooden fence rails, and the scent of alfalfa hung thick in the air. Marcus was already at work by the time the rest of the staff showed up, raking hay in the south paddock with the same quiet, deliberate focus as always. He didn't glance up when they passed him, didn't acknowledge the way conversation paused slightly in his presence. He didn't need to. He'd grown used to being underestimated, even invisible. But not to Ben. Not anymore. At exactly 8:13 a.m., the boy appeared at the edge of the barn, barefoot, pajama pants dusty, his face half-shadowed beneath a mop of unbrushed blonde hair. No one had called him. No one led him there. He simply came, clutching a crumpled drawing in one hand and scanning the grounds until his gaze found Marcus. Marcus saw him from the corner of his eye, stopped what he was doing, and knelt slowly, not beckoning, not speaking, just waiting. Ben took 3 steps forward, then stopped. He looked down at the paper in his hand, then back at Marcus. After a pause, he walked the rest of the way and held the drawing out with both hands. Marcus took it gently. It was a simple sketch, 2 stick figures beside a horse. No names, no background. But it was the first time Ben had willingly handed anything to anyone in almost a year. Is this us? Marcus asked softly. Ben didn't respond, but his fingers tightened slightly around the hem of his shirt. That was enough. Marcus smiled and nodded, folding the paper carefully and slipping it into his jacket pocket like a treasure. Thanks, little man, he said. I'll keep it safe. From a distance, Catherine watched the scene unfold from the office window. She said nothing, just stood there, arms limp at her sides, chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. There had been no therapy session scheduled that morning, no behavior plan activated, just a quiet man and a quiet boy, meeting on the same frequency the rest of the world couldn't seem to hear. By noon, the entire dynamic of the ranch had shifted. Ben began following Marcus during chores, copying his movements as he brushed the horses or cleaned the stalls. He didn't speak, didn't smile much, but he mimicked with stunning accuracy, down to the way Marcus folded the saddle blankets or coiled the ropes. When asked, Marcus said only, "Kids learn by watching. They trust what's consistent." That afternoon, Catherine called Marcus into the main house, into the sunroom where she kept her tea set, and an old upright piano no one played anymore. She poured 2 cups of lukewarm Earl Grey and pushed one toward him without a word. He sat across from her, back straight, hands folded in his lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, "I've hired people with PhDs and glowing resumes. None of them could do what you did." Marcus looked at her gently, no trace of pride in his face. "I didn't do anything. I just didn't leave." Catherine exhaled slowly, staring into her tea. "It's been so long since I've seen him look at someone like that. I'm not sure what scares me more, how quickly he connected to you, or how much I didn't see it coming." Marcus took a sip and said nothing. Some truths didn't need comment. "You'll keep working with him?" she asked, almost too quietly. "If he wants me to," Marcus replied. "This has to be on his terms." Catherine nodded. "Then we'll make it work. I want to try something different this time. No clipboard, no stopwatch, just what works." Marcus allowed himself the faintest smile. That's usually where healing starts. And for the first time in a long while, the sunroom didn't feel like a room full of ghosts. It felt like the beginning of something warmer, something honest. Over the next few days, something subtle but undeniable began to change at Willow Creek Ranch. It wasn't dramatic. There were no speeches, no sudden breakthroughs, but the rhythm of the place shifted. You could feel it in the way the horses seemed calmer, the way the air around the barn didn't buzz with as much tension, and most of all, in the way Ben moved. He still didn't speak. He still wore his emotions like a second skin, tight and fragile. But he no longer darted away at the sound of footsteps. He no longer flinched when someone entered a room too quickly. Instead, he lingered near Marcus, like a shadow that didn't want to be noticed, but couldn't help following the light. Marcus never asked him to do anything. He didn't instruct. He didn't command. He just moved with purpose, slow and deliberate, narrating his actions not for the boy, but for himself, almost like he was teaching the silence how to breathe. "Okay, Dusty, we're gonna try the currycomb today," he'd murmur as he stepped into the stall, Ben peeking in from the side. "Not too fast, just slow circles, like waves." And after a moment, Ben would step in too, picking up a second brush and mirroring the motion with a kind of quiet focus that made even the horses lower their heads in peace. One afternoon, while Marcus was rinsing out feed buckets behind the stables, he noticed a small figure crouched beside the old tack shed. Ben, with a piece of sidewalk chalk in one hand and a dozen sketches scattered around him. The boy was drawing horses, dozens of them, in different colors and sizes, some realistic, some impossibly abstract. But in the center of every drawing was a tall figure in a cap. Sometimes he was standing, sometimes riding. Once in the middle of a chaotic storm scene, he was simply kneeling, hand outstretched. Marcus approached slowly and crouched beside him, not saying a word. After a minute, Ben held up a drawing, a horse with wide eyes, flared nostrils, and a boy on its back, arms out like wings. Beneath it, in shaky but clear block letters, was a single word: safe. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. He nodded once. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's the goal." He didn't touch the boy, didn't praise or gush, just sat beside him in the dirt as the wind rustled the tall grass around them. Nearby, Catherine watched from the porch, her hand covering her mouth. She hadn't seen Ben draw since before the accident. She walked down toward them slowly, hesitated, then joined them on the ground, tucking her skirt beneath her legs. For a long time, none of them spoke, just the sound of chalk scratching against concrete, birds overhead, and the low, rhythmic breath of a child who, for once, wasn't running from the world. Catherine looked at Marcus and whispered, "Whatever this is you're doing, keep doing it." Marcus didn't answer right away. He just looked at Ben, then at the drawings spread like petals around them, and said, "It's not about doing. It's about staying. Most people don't." That evening, when the sun dipped low and turned the fields to gold, Catherine sat on her porch swing and watched her son help Marcus lead Dusty into the barn. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. And for the first time in years, she let herself hope, not for a miracle, but for a beginning. The next morning brought a softness to the air that only Texas spring could offer. Mist clung to the pasture like a secret, and the sky glowed pale lavender before the sun fully rose. Marcus stood by the paddock fence, sipping weak coffee from a tin mug, watching as Ben led Dusty in slow, careful steps around the looped trail. It wasn't perfect. His grip on the lead rope was loose, and he still glanced back every few seconds to make sure Marcus was there. But he was doing it, on his own. Catherine joined Marcus at the fence line, her arms folded, a look of quiet awe in her eyes. "He never walks the trail without someone holding his hand," she murmured. "Until today," Marcus replied, not taking his eyes off the boy. A silence fell between them, but it wasn't tense. It was the kind that carries a shared understanding, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with words. After a moment, Catherine asked, "Do you have children?" Marcus shook his head. "No, ma'am." She hesitated. "But you've been around kids like Ben?" He nodded slowly. "My sister's boy, Malik. He's older now, but when he was Ben's age, he didn't talk either. Took him 4 years to say mama. But he could hum gospel songs before he ever said a word." Catherine smiled, faint and surprised. "You hum too, you know. I've heard you. When you work." Marcus shrugged. "Some silences aren't meant to be broken. They're meant to be held." Catherine looked out at her son again, who was now crouched beside Dusty, gently cleaning the horse's hoof like Marcus had shown him. "What if this doesn't last?" she asked quietly. "What if it's just a phase?" Marcus glanced at her then, his gaze steady. "What if it isn't?" She swallowed hard. "I don't want to get my hopes up." "Maybe hope doesn't need to be loud," he said. "Maybe it just needs to be consistent." For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she whispered, "You're not what I expected when I hired a stable hand." Marcus gave a small smile. "Neither is Ben." And with that, he set down his mug, walked toward the boy, and crouched beside him. Not to take over, not to instruct, but simply to be there. Ben didn't look up, but he shifted slightly closer. Catherine watched them from the fence, and this time, when her breath caught, it wasn't from fear. It was from the unfamiliar comfort of watching her son begin to trust again. The following days unfolded like a slow melody. No sudden bursts of progress, no dramatic declarations, just a steady hum of connection that grew stronger with each sunrise. Ben's world, once so tightly sealed, began to open inch by inch. He still didn't speak, but now he pointed. He gestured. He touched Marcus's sleeve when he wanted help, and tugged gently at Catherine's hand when he wanted her near. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, and it was his. On the 5th morning since that moment in the barn, Catherine noticed something she hadn't seen in nearly 3 years. Ben was waiting by the barn gate at 7:00 a.m., clean, dressed, and ready. Not because anyone had asked, not because a schedule told him to. He simply wanted to be there, with Marcus. That morning, Marcus let Ben lead, quite literally. The boy chose the grooming tools, arranged the saddle blankets, and even led Dusty through a basic warm-up routine. The movements weren't perfect, but they didn't need to be. Marcus followed without correcting, reinforcing each decision with a nod or a quiet, "Good call." When they were done, Ben sat on a bale of hay just inside the barn, kicking his feet lightly against the wood. And Marcus sat beside him, close enough to feel present, far enough not to overwhelm. "You know," Marcus said softly, "most folks think healing comes in big moments. like light bulbs flicking on. He paused. But I think it's more like this. Like learning to breathe in a place that used to feel tight. Ben didn't look up, but he leaned into Marcus just slightly, resting his shoulder against the man's arm for barely a second before pulling away. It was small, but Catherine, standing in the shadows of the barn doors, felt the breath leave her lungs. That single touch said more than any word ever could. Later that afternoon, a white SUV rolled into the gravel driveway. It was clean, government-issued, with tinted windows and a Department of Child and Family Services emblem on the door. Catherine's chest tightened. She hadn't requested a visit. No one had. But protocol was protocol, and her sister-in-law, Ben's aunt, had made waves in the past, questioning Catherine's ability to parent. It was nothing new. Still, her heart pounded as the social worker stepped out, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp behind thin glasses. "I'm here for a wellness check," the woman said crisply. "Regarding Ben Langston." Catherine led her inside, offering tea that was politely declined. She answered the standard questions: school attendance, therapy sessions, sleep patterns, and bristled as the woman took notes without looking up. "Has the child shown any signs of distress, aggression, or regression?" "No," Catherine said, then added, "Actually, he's made more progress in the last week than he has in years." The social worker raised an eyebrow. "Documented by whom?" Before Catherine could answer, a quiet voice spoke from the kitchen doorway. "By me." Marcus stepped forward, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "I've been working with Ben daily. And I've seen it. I've felt it. You don't always need paperwork to know a child is safe." The woman eyed him, skeptical. "And you are?" "Marcus Bell, Stablehand, caregiver, whatever you want to call it." The woman scribbled something, clearly unimpressed. Then from behind her, the softest sound broke the tension. A voice, barely audible, fragile, uncertain. "Safe." Everyone froze. Catherine turned, eyes wide. Ben stood at the end of the hallway, clutching his drawing pad to his chest. He'd spoken, just one word, but it was his. It belonged to him. The social worker looked stunned. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. Marcus didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, still as a mountain, letting the moment bloom. Because he knew. That was more than enough. The air in the house stood still after that single word. Safe. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't repeated. It was quiet, barely more than a breath, but it carried the weight of something sacred. Catherine felt her knees tremble as she stepped toward her son, afraid to startle him, afraid that even the sound of her joy might close the door he'd just dared to open. Ben didn't run. He didn't flinch. He simply looked up at her with those wide, steady eyes and waited. She knelt down slowly, cupped the side of his face, and whispered, "Yes, sweetheart, you are safe." Marcus stood in the background, hands at his sides, watching with a softness in his eyes that no one had ever bothered to look for. The social worker scribbled furiously into her notes, clearly unsure how to process what had just happened. Catherine didn't care. The data would never capture this. The paperwork couldn't explain what it meant for a child who hadn't spoken in nearly 3 years to claim safety with his own voice. That was not a box you could check. That evening, after the social worker had left and the house had gone quiet again, Catherine found Marcus sitting out by the pasture, leaning against a wooden post with Dusty grazing nearby. She brought him a cup of tea without saying anything and sat beside him. For a while they just listened to the wind move through the tall grass, the distant sound of a horse snorting in the barn. Finally, Catherine said, "He's never said that word before. Not once." Marcus nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the fading horizon. "It wasn't for us," he said. It was for himself. When she looked over at him, seeing not just the stablehand anymore, not even just the man who had somehow reached her son, but a quiet strength she hadn't realized she'd been leaning on. "How did you know what he needed?" she asked. Marcus didn't answer right away. He just let out a long breath and said, "Because I know what it feels like when the world gives up on your voice, and what it means when someone stays anyway." Catherine blinked away the tears threatening her vision. She wanted to say thank you, but somehow it didn't seem big enough. So instead, she said the one thing she knew mattered more. "You belong here, Marcus. This is your place, too." Marcus gave the faintest smile. "Then I guess I'll stay." The next morning, the sky broke open with sunlight so warm it poured over the fields like honey. Marcus rose early as always, his boots crunching lightly across the gravel as he made his way to the barn. He moved with the same quiet rhythm, but something in his steps had softened, as if the weight he carried had shifted, not disappeared, but settled into something he could walk with. Inside the barn, Ben was already there. He sat cross-legged near Dusty's stall, scribbling into a worn notebook with a green crayon, his blonde hair catching the morning light. He looked up when Marcus entered, not startled, just expectant, like he knew Marcus would come. And of course, he did. Marcus crouched beside him, not asking about the drawings, not reaching to correct, just watching. Ben finished a line, then turned the notebook around. It was another stick figure sketch, 2 people standing beneath a tree, a horse in the background, and the word "stay" written carefully in all caps across the top. Marcus blinked. "That's a good word," he said gently. "One of the best." Ben didn't speak, but he gave a single, subtle nod. Catherine arrived not long after, her arms full of paperwork and a half-drunk cup of coffee. She paused at the door when she saw the 2 of them, the boy and the man, sitting side by side in the dust and morning light, and she felt something tug hard at her chest. It was peace. But more than that, it was connection, a bridge she'd feared would never exist now stretching between them. Later that day, after chores were done and the ranch had settled into its afternoon quiet, Catherine sat across from Marcus at the picnic table near the edge of the paddock. She hesitated before speaking, then said, "I talked to Dr. Kessler this morning, Ben's therapist." Marcus looked up. "Yeah?" "He wants to come out next week and observe. He said he's never seen Ben respond like this, not to anyone." Marcus gave a small shrug. "It's not about me. It's about trust. And time." Catherine studied him for a moment. "Would you consider making it official, not just as staff, as Ben's therapeutic support, paid, formal, with access to training, resources, whatever you need?" Marcus looked down at the table, then back at her. "Only if I get to keep showing up like this. No clipboards, no white coats, just me and the boy. That's the only way this works." Catherine smiled. "Then it's a deal." And in that quiet handshake beneath the Texas sky, something was sealed, something no contract could truly define. The official paperwork came in a plain manila envelope a few days later, dropped off by a courier who didn't stay long enough to ask questions. Catherine handed it to Marcus without fanfare, just a quiet nod and the kind of smile that held both gratitude and caution. Inside was a formal letter from the state's Developmental Support Office, approving Marcus Bell as an in-home therapeutic aide for Benjamin Langston. It came with a list of guidelines, a name tag, and an optional training schedule, most of which Marcus skimmed through without much interest. What mattered wasn't the title. It was the trust behind it. Still, the shift was felt. Word traveled fast across the county, especially among the tight-lipped circle of parents who'd once brought their children to Willow Creek. Some were curious, others skeptical, a few outright disapproving. "A stablehand with no formal license?" someone muttered at the feed store. "Seems risky." But others defended him, slowly and then more boldly, "I've seen that boy laugh," one woman said. "I don't care if the man's never been to college. Whatever he's doing, it's working." Marcus, for his part, ignored the talk. He'd spent too much of his life being underestimated to start reacting now. Instead, he kept showing up. Each morning at 7 o'clock sharp, he met Ben at the barn. Their sessions weren't scripted. There were no printed exercises, no flashcards or behavioral tracking. Instead, there were walks through the pasture, whispered stories to the horses, and a quiet rhythm that didn't need explanation. One morning, Marcus brought out an old guitar from his truck, dusty and missing a string. He sat under the shade of the big pecan tree and began to play. Not well, not cleanly, but with a steady, soulful hum that filled the open space like sunlight through leaves. Ben approached slowly, crouched nearby, and listened. Then, after a long while, he began to tap his fingers against his leg, mimicking the beat. Catherine watched from the porch, her hand pressed gently against her lips. She didn't want to interrupt. Moments like that felt too fragile, like spider silk in the wind, stronger than it looked, but easily broken. That evening, during dinner, Ben reached for the salt without prompting. When Catherine thanked him, he looked up and, barely above a whisper, said, "You're welcome." The words stopped her mid-bite. She didn't cry, not then. But later, in the kitchen, she stood at the sink long after the dishes were done, just holding the edge of the counter, letting the stillness of the house wrap around her like a memory she'd once feared lost. Marcus found her there a few minutes later. He didn't say much, just poured 2 glasses of sweet tea, handed her one, and leaned against the fridge like he'd lived there all his life. "You look like someone carrying both relief and fear," he said, softly. She nodded, eyes shining. "Because that's exactly what it is. Every step forward feels like a gift. And a cliff." Marcus stared into his tea. "That's what progress feels like. Uneasy, but real." Catherine looked at him then, really looked. This man who had entered her life by accident, who had no polished credentials or framed degrees, just presence and patience, and a way of listening that didn't demand performance. "I don't think I've ever told you," she said. "Thank you for not walking away." Marcus met her eyes. "Wasn't planning to." And in the quiet kitchen, beneath the hum of the ceiling fan and the fading sounds of night animals just outside, something unspoken settled between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. 2 people carrying different kinds of grief, both learning how to stay. The next Saturday, the ranch held its first open day in nearly a year. It wasn't a big event, just a quiet gathering for local families whose children had once been regulars at Willow Creek before the program slowed down. Catherine had sent out handwritten invitations, unsure if anyone would even come. But by mid-morning, cars lined the dusty driveway, and the sound of small footsteps, laughter, and cautious greetings returned to the land, like music long forgotten. Marcus didn't say much during setup. He hammered in signposts, arranged folding chairs in the shade, and helped string colorful streamers between the trees out front. Ben stayed close to his side, clutching a small clipboard Catherine had given him, and taking his new role as assistant greeter more seriously than anyone expected. When families began to arrive, some paused at the sight of Marcus, curious, even hesitant. A few parents watched him closely as their children approached the stables. One little girl with pigtails and a sunflower dress clung tightly to her mother's leg until Marcus knelt down, extended an open palm, and gently whistled a 2-note tune that brought Dusty to the fence. The girl stepped forward slowly, then smiled. Just like that, the hesitation faded. Throughout the day, Marcus never took center stage, but his presence rippled. He guided nervous children through brushing routines, taught one boy how to feed a horse with a flat palm, and helped Catherine with a demonstration on how therapeutic riding had helped kids like Ben rebuild trust in a world that had once felt unsafe. Ben, meanwhile, stayed engaged longer than anyone anticipated. He didn't speak often, but he led 2 children around the paddock with a lead rope, pointed out where the brushes were stored, and, at one point, giggled when a horse sneezed directly onto his arm. The sound startled Catherine so much that she froze where she stood, unsure if she'd imagined it. Marcus caught her eye across the paddock and gave the faintest nod. Yes, it had happened. That evening, after the last car left and the sky turned a soft shade of rose, Catherine found Marcus sitting near the garden with Ben curled beside him, half asleep against his shoulder. She sat on the stone bench across from them and let the silence linger. "Today felt like what I always hoped this ranch could be," she said softly. "Open, honest, healing." Marcus looked down at Ben, who shifted in his sleep but didn't wake. "He did more than I expected," Catherine added, "but maybe I should stop expecting and start noticing." Marcus smiled faintly. "That's where all the good stuff is, in the noticing." She nodded, heart full. "I think we might be getting it right." He didn't answer, but the quiet between them said enough.